Right, hello, it's been a while. So instead of just gushing over everything that's been happening, how about we talk about the fact that I've still been doing stuff? This is a Hazel mask from Umbrella Academy, a series that I have yet to watch despite it being relevant to my work. So, whatever. But as always with these sculpts, we start off by massing out. For those of you who always ask, I am using a Monster Maker Ed head as my armature. It can be bought from many special effects places. A little harder to get outside of the US, so I had to pay a bit of a premium. Also, I do get a bit silly when I'm just doing the massing out stage, but it can be gotten. And there's a new version actually, because this is the old version. There's a new version which has a resin shell around the outside, and since this one's actually coming apart, despite using it for a few years, so I got a good mileage out of it. So yeah, have a look out for that. When it comes to the clay, I am using. Oh, actually, what clay did I use here? When it comes to the clay, I'm using buff clay. It is a standard stoneware clay. I don't want to use wed clay because wed clay is a bit more expensive than this, and really it's a big bulky sculpt. I could bulk out the inside of it with wadded up tinfoil, but because it's not that large, and also there's not going to be any places that overbalance and need to be reinforced, I felt I could do the whole thing out of one big clay. And since it doesn't need any details, it's big, smooth shapes, or big and organic. I felt just using cheap stoneware clay would work. Besides, we're actually taught to do portrait sculpture at university. Back at university. Oh God, I graduated. I have a degree now. I have to get a job. But back at university, we were actually taught portraiture sculpture using buff clay. So it can take a lot of details. Now that we've got it all masked out, the entire area that we want it to cover on the head, you can see we're starting to work in the anatomy. The anatomy is basically all the big shapes that we're going to be putting all of the details in later. This is where we want to get our basic symmetry down, because when you start to put textures and details on, it's very hard to go back. And also, it's very hard to make sure you get all of your details on in the exact right positions without as symmetrical as possible a base. You can see here actually one cheek is higher than the other. I go back later and solve that, and one of the ways I solve it is by basically using Photoshop. You can use whatever editing software you use, and I edit and I take a photo square on, square to the side, and in whatever orientation I have for the reference images, and then you overlay them, have one transparent, have one not, and then you can see where it doesn't match your reference material, or you can mirror it on itself to see where it's not even. And also it helps to take photos of your work as you go along, because that allows you to have a different eye's view, because you've been sitting there looking at your sculpt for hours, absolute hours, and you get blindness to some of the imperfections of it, or you just don't care enough because you've been at it for hours. So quite often it's good to put it down for a little while, come back the next day, and you will see what needs doing. So with this stage, because we're still not putting details in, I'm using plenty of water to keep the surface smooth, since the entire thing does want to be quite smooth because they're very cartoonish characters. I'm not actually worried, unlike with wed clay, which is my usual sculpting medium, I'm not worried about swamping this clay, because this clay isn't stabilised, the surface doesn't get all swampy and nasty like wed clay does. I might be speaking out of ignorance, but I think it comes down to something like the lanolin that stabilises wed clay, absorbs the water and gets really mucky and muddy on the top, and I refer to it as swamping. Whereas with the buff clay, it can only absorb so much water, and then the rest of it just runs off of it, so it doesn't actually get too wet to handle. It still helps dry it out a little when you want to put your surface details on, and in fact you can see me here using the fact that it's quite wet and using a silicone kidney tool to smooth the surface out for its final sort of rest before I start to put the details on. And then you can see it's suddenly gone all matte. That's because this is a day later after we've had it covered overnight, but I didn't let it rehydrate overnight like you would with some clay. So it's gone matte, you can tell it's not too wet, And now we actually get our center line. This is something I learned from portraiture sculpture, is having your center line down the middle where everything can relate off both sides, especially with this character who has the two big eyes on them that I want to make sure are as even as possible. And in fact, I have a reference image and I've marked where the top of the eye is and the bottom of the eye is, and those horizontal lines off of the center line there are actually the ones that I'm going to be working on, and they all relate to different parts of the eye and different parts of the facial details. In fact, you can even see me using a set of calipers. They're not like the digital vernier calipers, they're just a set of measuring calipers to make sure that the things are the same distance off the edge of one side of the center line as they are the other side of the center line, so I can have it as mirrored as possible. Thankfully, these are big, bold, cartoonish shapes that should be quite forgiving, a lot like a lot of biological sculpts. Because this is a big, cartoonish head, it should be very forgiving of not being perfectly symmetrical. So whilst we're not going to lean on that, we're also not going to punish ourselves too much. Also, the original reference material we're working of is quite... Now, the word I want to use is sketchy, but I mean sketchy as in it looks very homemade. It's very like a sketch rather than a digital model, if that makes sense. It's very handmade. That they look like they are very cartoonish. They have a very distinct aesthetic in that the painting isn't perfect on them, the shapes aren't perfect, and so I feel it is totally legitimate to not do this as like a 3D print, basically, because a big bulbous 3D print, you could like 3 or 4 spheres all together, you could print the whole thing out as a big helmet. I don't think that would look right. But when it comes to looking right or wrong, what it actually comes down to for this piece of work is the client. The client has requested a big soft mask, a foam and latex mask, rather than a big resin helmet thing. So one of the reasons why later down the way we actually mould the things in plaster rather than silicone is because they're going to be a latex skin with a foam core on the inside to hold them rigid and such, and then you put your head in and blah blah blah. So the client wanted a soft mask rather than a solid mask. So so yeah, you can see we've built out the eyes using those marks, and now I'm putting the teeth in. And rather than putting a block of clay on and then sculpting the teeth out of it, I'm actually cutting thin sheets of clay out, cutting teeth-shaped bits, putting them up to the sculpt, cutting them down and then placing them in. That way, all of the teeth I put on are actually a uniform thickness. They betray some of their non-thickness on the outsides where they meet the cheeks, but I go back and sort that out later when I'm like comparing it to my reference images and such, and also trying to get it even and trying to look nice, because the hardest parts of this sculpt to get right were where the cheeks meet the side of the teeth and where the eyes meet the top of the cheeks, because on the reference material it's quite obscured because they are things getting in the way. I haven't even talked about how the ears were done. The ears, really easy. Just about getting them nice and even was the trouble. Now, the pupils themselves are 3D on this, so I built them out slowly, and much like the actual iris, no, the iris is 3D. The pupils are where the wearer sees through. And the good thing about stuff like holes is that you can the good thing about holes like that is that you can slowly build them up and get them as even as you like by kind of sculpting away at them rather than just trying to get them right the first time, blah blah blah. And the same with the built out iris. I've always found building a 3D structure on a clay plane is easier than scoring in that same structure in a circle. So if you can, I would always try and give a little bit of dimensionality, which is a word I realise I've used a fair bit in the past and I still don't actually know if it's an actual word. Oh well. Dimensionality, because the edge, where the edge meets the rest of the sculpt, it tends to be quite forgiving because you can sculpt it away, you can add to it a bit and so on and so forth. And that we get to a place where I'm quite happy with the base of the entire head. And now there's a couple of extra details to put on, like this might have been a good place to have put the ears on, a good time to put the ears on, whilst everything else is there in context. But I felt that going from the top down with the overall shape of the head, having the ears on early gave context where the eyes and the top of the face, the top of the discoloured face area goes. But it's also the point where we put the nose on, as you can see, and the perfectly round cheek circles. The problem with things that are perfectly round in sculpting is that it's the same issue of drawing a perfect circle. So what I actually did was search my workshop for a couple of minutes and then actually go out to the kitchen and get a small ramekin and use that to impression it in. And then it was just a case of final touch-ups. And that was that. We finished it there. Because I'm quite out of practice at this, I didn't do a full 360. I hope you'll forgive me. However, all the mould making was done on stream, along with the painting and such. So hopefully you'll join me back for those mould making, painting, and we'll see how that all goes. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop it down in the comments. Don't forget to share this with any of your Umbrella Academy friends, and I will see you next time. Bye.